Pretty soon I started to have a love for science fiction and fantasy films. Gorgo, the Godzilla ripoff I saw in Williamsburg, was only the beginning. I loved Kanga, which was a ripoff of King Kong. I loved The Crawling Eye, which was an English film with this hideous octopus-looking thing with one eyeball in the middle of its head. That scared the pants off me. The third ingredient in this new consciousness was comic books. One day, during one of the half-hour play periods at 206 Wilson, I saw my first comic books. They were Superman and Batman comics, and I was hooked. I knew Superman from TV, but I had no idea who this Batman was, but the other kids all seemed to. I went down the street to the house of one of the other yeshiva kids, and he had a pile of comics. Not just superheroes, but Challengers of the Unknown and House of Mystery, and many more. I would read and reread them, and they took me far away from where I was. Meanwhile, all around me, society was changing and shifting. This was at the very beginning of the civil rights era, and if there were signs of progress, there were also persistent signs of unrest. After a year in the yeshiva, my mother and I moved from Brooklyn back to Queens, to Jackson Heights, where I attended a public school at Junction Boulevard and 93rd Street. That marked another chapter in my American education because it was my first contact with black kids. In fact, my two best friends were black because they were the tall guys, and they stood in the back of the line with me. The fact that they were black and I was white never dawned on me. It wasn't something that I had much experience with in Israel, and it wasn't emphasized around my house, but slowly I began to get the sense that there were racial lines drawn between people. I remember going to one of the black kids' houses after school. His name was Walter, and he was my friend. His mother would fix us sandwiches and we would play games. As darkness came, his mother would reappear in the room and remind me that it was time to go home. I had another black friend named Alfred, and some afternoons he would lend me a second bicycle, and we would go riding around near LaGuardia Airport. As we headed for home, we would get close to Junction Boulevard, and he would say, "Well, you better not come bike riding in there, it's not safe." I didn't understand, even after he explained it to me. I was very naive at that time, even willfully so, because I was not a street kid. I was a television kid. I lived in the world of Superman and the Twilight Zone. One of my best friends in Newtown High School was black, and he and I would hang out after school and sing doo-wop. 2 or 3 of us would get together and harmonize. Nothing fancy, just a chance to sing. And after Martin Luther King was shot, he showed me a small axe he had hidden in his shirt and told me that maybe he and I shouldn't hang out with each other because his friends were really angry. But I remember feeling scared, telling him that I was sorry about what had happened and that I didn't have anything to do with it. He said, "Yeah, but my friends don't understand. They're really angry." That was the end of our friendship. Educated Jews, well-read Jews, were very interested in the civil rights movement because they saw the parallels between the way blacks were treated in America and the way the Jews had been treated throughout history. We had been slaves in Egypt, and they were slaves in America. But an intellectual and emotional interest in social conditions that didn't always translate to the street. However complicated the social conditions of mid-1960s America were, and they were very complicated, I could always lose myself in television. Not that I watched indiscriminately. At the time, live TV did nothing for me. There were variety shows that my mother would watch, but they didn't interest me. The camera stood still, which was a pretty severe technical limitation, and as a result, you couldn't really be swept away. A still setup with a guy talking and the camera standing still, I'm snoring. But the one thing that did interest me was the fact that on some of these shows, girls would scream for the performers. I hadn't put it all together yet. The girls on the Mickey Mouse Club, who always seemed to be wasting the boys' time, people screaming on TV, but it felt like something major. Then one day I was looking out the window at 99 South 9th Street in Brooklyn. I was 12 years old, probably. And I saw a Spanish girl jumping rope. She had long black hair that hung down past her waist. It was straight, and it shone like vinyl. And every time she jumped, the hair would slap against her backside. I didn't see that girl's face. I have yet to see her face. But that was the first time I had this odd, tingly feeling, and over the next few months, as it happened over and over again, I figured out that something strange was going on, in my mind and in my body. It's almost like when you're developing a cold. My muscles started to ache, and I started to feel bizarre, like I'd never felt in my life. Different parts of my body got engorged, and I started growing hair in places where I didn't have hair before, and I got scared. I would run to the bathroom with scissors and try to cut the hair off. I couldn't speak of those things to my mother. I'm feeling weird, there's this girl I like, and I'm starting to grow hair between my legs. Oh my God, the world is ending. Gradually, I started to see all this as a good thing. My mother and I would watch the Ed Sullivan Show on Sunday nights. That's when she was home, and every once in a while we would see a teen idol on the show, Bobby Rydell or somebody like that, and we would hear the girls in the audience scream. When I was 10 or 11, that didn't make any sense to me. When I was 12, even though I still thought it was bizarre, I liked it. It struck me that these teen idols had a kind of power over these screaming girls, and also that there was something extremely pleasurable about watching these girls lose control. Still, it was a very respectable kind of screaming, almost subdued. Just a year and a half later, when I was a bit older, I would be watching the Ed Sullivan Show again. But the screaming wouldn't be quite so subdued, and on stage, there wouldn't be a single teen idol with slicked back hair, but 4 teen idols with shaggy hair and funny accents. When I saw that, I understood everything about the world in a flash. Crazy, Crazy Nights, the 60s and the Beatles, 1964 to 1969. I was oblivious to Elvis. I never saw him on television, so in some sense, he didn't really exist for me. And while I was vaguely aware of him as a recording artist, I didn't think much of him. He was just another one of those guys who sang, and besides Hound Dog and Jailhouse Rock, it really wasn't the kind of music that I was interested in. It was crooning, and it was too smooth. So when Elvis appeared on Ed Sullivan, wriggling his pelvis, it wasn't a major turning point for me. But then in 1964, my mother and I were sitting around one Sunday night, in the middle of our usual ritual, dinner and Ed Sullivan. I was eating homemade hamburgers that my mother used to make, and peas. I wasn't a fan of most vegetables, but I didn't mind peas, so she must have just loaded me up with them whenever she could. So there I was with the hamburgers, the peas, and Ed Sullivan. And Sullivan started saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight on our show we have the Beatles." I didn't know what he was talking about. Cockroaches? Bugs? Was this one of those novelty acts that sometimes came on the show, like a flea circus? Then they came on stage and the entire Beatles phenomena just hit me like a ton of bricks. All at once, as hard as anything had ever hit me. They had these haircuts that at the same time I thought were silly. Oh my God, I thought, they're dressed like girls. That was my first impression. My second thought was that they looked like monkeys. That was apparently a popular notion because I think it's where the monkeys got their name. Through 2 thoughts, I wasn't sold on the Beatles. But then my mother walked into the room and she remarked on how ridiculous their appearance was, and at that point I did an abrupt about-face. I said, "No, Mom, I think they look cool." I liked the idea that I thought they were cool and my mother didn't. I liked the difference. I wanted there to be a difference. It was a form of rebellion. And at that moment, all the things I had wondered about for months started to make sense. These guys in these silly girl haircuts and the girls screaming for them at the top of their lungs, my first thoughts about pop music were born on that night. And they were simple thoughts. If I go and start a band, maybe the girls will scream for me. Don't let anybody tell you any different. That same impulse launched 1,000 bands. In fact, the first record I remember owning came very early, before the Beatles, before Ed Sullivan and everything else. On WOR-TV in New York, the twist was in full swing, and Chubby Checker had an afternoon TV show, sort of an instructional spot to teach kids how to do the dance. I remember being so fascinated by the whole phenomenon that I actually went out and bought a teen magazine that had capsule biographies of the big stars of the day. I found out that Chubby Checker's real name was Ernest Evans, that he was a chicken plucker, and that Dick Clark's wife had named him Chubby Checker that is, after Fats Domino. I had never heard of Hank Ballard and the Midnighters, who originally did the song. I didn't know anything, really. But I started to twist and to participate in these twist contests. Wednesday afternoons after school, we all stayed for dance contests. I'd go up and dance with the black girls, because they knew how to shimmy and shake. The white girls talked too much and dressed too dowdy. The rest of the guys stayed off on one side. The white girls thought that was dangerous at first, but soon they too would come up and start dancing. I won the twist contest, and my prize was a Nat King Cole 45 with "All Over the World" on one side and "Rambling Rose" on the other. Initially I wasn't that crazy about it, but eventually I came to see the point. Since music, not just the twist, not just Nat King Cole, but all music, was my entree to the soft, milky thighs of girls, I would soon realize that music was the key that made the girls welcome me with open arms and eventually open legs. This is the big secret of being in a rock and roll band. There are no messages. There's no inner being striving to express itself through music. We all picked up guitars because we all wanted to get laid. Plain and simple. At first, my dreams weren't grand. I didn't think about conquering the world of girls. I thought about improving my standing with the girls down the block. How do you get noticed by the girls down the block? Simple. You play in a band that plays the school dance. So I put together a band with two friends from school, Danny Haber and Seth Dogramagian, both of whom have unfortunately passed on. We went to school together at Joseph Pulitzer Middle School in Queens, New York, and we were all close friends because we were all obsessed with comic books. Seth and I used to publish amateur fanzines about comic books and science fiction. We would write articles, review movies, and talk about characters from television shows. His fanzine was called Exile, mine was called Cosmos. But after the Beatles, it became clear to us that as much as we loved science fiction, it wasn't going to get us where we wanted to go with the girls. So we formed a band called The Lynx. I didn't even think about how to spell it, but I had the animal in mind. At school, when we performed at a talent show, we were introduced as The Missing Lynx, which of course changed the spelling. The first two songs we did were There's a Place by the Beatles and Kathy's Clown by the Everly Brothers. We picked them for their three-part harmonies because all of us wanted to sing. Danny and Seth played guitar, and I just stood there singing. I hadn't picked up the bass yet. I'd like to say I was the front man, but the truth was that it was a three-man band. Somehow, the Missing Lynx won the talent show. We loved being on stage and having everyone watch us. When it came to being the center of attention, we were naturals. After that talent show, a couple of things happened. First of all, I started to have friends. Many of them people whose names I didn't even know. Guys would walk up to me in the hall or on the street and say, "How you doing, Gene? What's up?" Also, all of a sudden, I started getting into trouble in class. Up until then, I was a pretty good student, pretty well behaved. Even though I was always the tallest guy in class, I was never in any fights, never got sent down to detention. After the Missing Lynx won the talent show, though, I started to get the evil eye from teachers, because girls were turning around during class and asking me questions. There was one girl named Stella, and she was in Mrs. Casola's class with me. During class one day she turned around and said, "Hey, Gene, will you show us that weird thing you do with your tongue?" I didn't know what she meant at first. It must have been something she saw me do at recess, but gradually I got the idea that she wanted me to stick out my tongue and wiggle it around. The second I did that, they started giggling, and the teacher came right over. "Gene Klein," she said, "did you stick out your tongue?" "Yeah," I said, "but the girls asked me to do it." "Go to the principal's office," she said. As far as I was concerned, I was being railroaded. Stella had asked me to stick my tongue out, so I stuck it out. But I realized that the teacher thought it was something sexual because her face turned red. When you have a band and then you get in a little trouble, your reputation soars. Even the tough kids in school started giving me respect, although it was an odd sort of respect. This one guy named Danny was a weightlifter. He was huge and looked sort of like Harvey Keitel. He must have been older than the rest of us. He always had his troops around him, and he would walk down the hall, pushing everyone else out of the way. For some reason, he never picked on me. And I'm certain the reason was the Missing Lynx and this small but persistent bit of local fame I had stumbled into. The closest he ever got to beating me up was to call me Doof. That was okay with me since I didn't even know what the word meant. But he never laid a hand on me, and he even offered to protect me. "If anyone else ever lays a hand on you, you let me know, all right?" You'd think I would have used the opportunity to start hanging out with the guys, get a little gang of my own, but I wasn't interested. I just wanted to get back to my beloved television. After school, everybody would hang out in the schoolyard and smoke cigarettes and get into trouble. I'd run home, turn on the television set, and do my homework, and I was set. I was back doing what I loved. In fact, not only did I not hang out after school, but I hardly ever had visitors come over to my house, because when they did come over, I'd ignore them and just watch TV. My house was not a fun place to go to. All I had were comic books and science fiction and fantasy magazines. The other guys were interested in bikes and baseball bats and going outside and doing sporty things. They were chewing gum and spitting, and they'd start talking in hushed tones about Mickey Mantle, and I tried, maybe for a little while, but I found that I just couldn't care at all. Mickey Mantle next to Superman? Hands down, Superman. Are you kidding? Mickey Mantle couldn't fly. Tuesdays and Thursdays were the most exciting days of the week, because that's when the new comic books came into the candy store, and I'd be there as soon as I could. The store owner knew me by name, and he would tell me what was coming up and ask if he should save me a copy. Fantastic Four, Thor, and all of those movie magazines like Famous Monsters of Filmland. Soon I had a stack of comics and magazines higher than me. In fact, my comics collection became the basis for my next business. My mother had gotten me a mimeograph machine, which I used to publish those science fiction and fantasy fanzines, and soon it occurred to me that I could use the same machine to make some money. I started printing up flyers that said, "Willing to buy comic books," with my phone number on them. I had a set price, $1 a pound, and that meant that I would get between 50 and 100 comic books for $1. The people who were selling to me didn't have the expertise or the energy to go through the collections themselves, so I would look through thousands of issues, and usually I would find 1 or 2 books that were genuine collectibles. One collector's comic book could fetch me $100. Despite the fact that I spent my afternoons and evenings in front of the television, and with my nose buried in comic books, my music career started to take on a life of its own. Seth and I eventually brought in another guy whose name was Stephen Carnell. I had known Steve for years, and he ended up being in a number of bands with me, including Wicked Lester, which was a precursor to Kiss. This was around 1965, and the 4 of us, along with a drummer named Stan Singer, began to play more than just the school dances. Even though we existed largely because of the Beatles, and in the wake of the Beatles, we didn't play a single Beatles song. They were much too complex. Instead, we tried our hand at some soul standards like In the Midnight Hour and La Bamba, and anything else that was easy to play. The lesson I had learned with the Missing Links, I learned again and again. It's great to be a guy in a band. Then, just before I turned 14, everything changed again. This time, it wasn't music, and it wasn't girls. It was women. And it was a whole different thing. I had a paper delivery route in Jackson Heights, Queens, where I would throw papers to people's doors every morning, and then once a week I had to collect the subscription money from customers. Around Christmas, I was going from house to house getting payments, getting some tips. One customer was an older woman. In retrospect, she must have been in her early 20s, but to me she was a grown-up, and she was on the other side of the line. Kids over here, grown-ups over there. Because she was a grown-up, I was mostly oblivious to her, but not totally oblivious because I remember thinking to myself that she was attractive. Anyway, before the Christmas holiday, I went to collect the money, and she answered the door, dressed in one of those frilly nightgowns, and crying. I tried to leave. I said, I'll come back later. She insisted that I come inside, and she started talking a mile a minute about her husband and how he was away and how she was lonely. She was clearly drunk. She was saying she would get my money for me in a second, but plenty of seconds went by, and she didn't make any attempt to get me my money. And then everything happened in a flash. All of a sudden, I was down on the couch, and she was on top of me. I don't even remember to this day how my pants came off. I wasn't exactly a Casanova. I had my hands up near my shoulders with my palms out, like I was trying to stop an oncoming car, and all of a sudden, it was over. Then she gave me a tip, and I left. I was terrified, both during and after. Whenever I saw her again, and I saw her many times, because she was still on my paper route, not having had the good sense to move away after this episode, I would take her money and run. There was no one I could talk to about it, really. Sexual discussions with my mother were off limits. I did eventually mention it to one of the guys at the school, another self-styled rebel, and he must have talked it around because soon everybody seemed to know. In the schoolyard, the girls would point, and I acquired some additional celebrity to go along with my band celebrity because I had done it. I was oblivious for the first 13 years of my life that I was endowed with a very large oral appendage, my super long tongue. It really was longer than everyone else's, and I was soon to find out that having a long tongue came in handy with the girls. One of the girls who seemed to like me was named Connie. She was Italian Catholic, and she kept asking me to walk her home. I thought she simply wanted to be my girlfriend, but in retrospect, it's clear that she had carnal intentions. One day we were walking home after school. She explained to me what girls were like. I was stunned and fascinated. "You want me to put what? Where?" She explained that she couldn't get pregnant that way. When I escorted her to the entrance of her apartment complex, she led me downstairs to the basement where the laundry room was. It was dark and empty. We were alone. She lowered herself to the floor and pulled me on top of her. Between passionate kisses, she hiked up her dress, lowered her panties, put her right hand behind my head, and gently pushed me down between her thighs. I was scared. I had heard stories, especially from the Italian guys on the school grounds. "Hey, you crazy or something? You put your face down there, you're going to get sick." She immediately started moaning, and I became aroused like I never had. I thought she wanted me to kiss her there. I did. It sent her into further ecstasy, and then, as if a sign from heaven told me everything I needed to know, I heard a voice plead, "Oh, Jean, your tongue. Give me your tongue." I did. No sooner did I make contact with her than she went into violent convulsions, wrapped both her hands behind my head, and rammed her pelvis into my face. She squirmed her entire body and used my tongue like a hot knife through butter. Although the entire event sticks in my mind as having lasted a long time, it probably only took her 30 seconds to achieve orgasm. This was my baptism by fire. I owned her. She lay there on the basement floor in complete surrender. For the rest of my life, I would remember that early encounter and what I could do with my tongue. But it wasn't over, not yet. A few moments passed, and we talked a little as I lay beside her. While I was in mid-sentence, she reached over and put her right hand between my legs. She raised herself up, undid my jeans, and pulled them down, and immediately wrapped her mouth around me. Though I was barely conscious, I noticed that she held me with her left hand and was manipulating herself with the right. Sadly, this was to be the only encounter between us. She soon moved away. And if she hears this, I hope she remembers it fondly. I certainly do. I started having off-the-cuff conversations in school about my encounter. When I told one of the guys about it and stuck my tongue out to show him what I had done with it, he remarked how goddamn long it was. I never knew. I never thought it mattered. But when I started showing girls my length, they were clearly impressed. The tongue incident ushered in a whole new era in my love life. I had only just turned 14, but since I was tall, I kept being invited to Sweet 16 parties, even though I was a little younger. There were all these girls whose names I still remember. Belinda and Irene and Barbara and Andrea. They were the cool girls, the ones the guys wanted to go out with at night, and for some reason, they wanted me at their parties. Those parties were filled with the kinds of things I had never seen before. Turning down the lights and playing records and spin the bottle. There was also slow dancing. Irene, I think, was the first girl who picked me to dance. It was ladies' choice, and we were moving together, and the lights were down, and everybody started kissing. Then all of a sudden, she stuck her tongue in my mouth. I thought I was going to throw up or drop dead. And then while she was sticking her tongue in my mouth, she took my hands and moved them down below her waist. I had a queasy feeling, that same tingly feeling I had from the girl jumping rope, but stronger. Then I got the hang of it, and I stuck my tongue into her mouth, and all of a sudden she started moaning. Then the song ended, we parted, then everybody went over to the table to have chips. While I was thinking over what had just happened, 2 other girls came up and asked me to dance. I didn't have a clue what was going on, but apparently word had gotten around that I knew what I was doing, and they wanted to try having me stick my tongue in their mouths too. The seeds of what would later be Kiss were all planted during this period. Television, the Beatles, superheroes, science fiction, girls. Everything about America was coalescing in my mind. Being in a band also opened up certain social situations. For example, I didn't know what a country club was. We were still relatively poor. But in the summer, my next band, the Long Island Sounds, got invited to play at various country clubs around the area. We walked into these places and we were amazed. Everyone there was being served. They had drinks that they took with them into the swimming pool. They drove nice cars. After one of the dances, a girl invited me to come back the following Saturday for a swim date. I came back happily, and the 2 of us went swimming, which was really just an excuse for making out in the pool. Our heads were above the water, but our bodies were underwater, and we were hugging and necking and kissing. Her parents were nearby, but they couldn't see us, or pretended that they couldn't. I must have been nervous because in the middle of this I felt as though I had to let out some gas. In fact, a major amount of gas. I thought I was pretty sophisticated, and that I could do it so that it would come out silent. In class, at least, I never let a raspberry go full steam. I finagled the cheeks left and right, and kind of squirmed for the sake of subtlety. In the pool, I figured that it was even easier, but for some reason logic escaped me, and it didn't occur to me that the gas would rise. All of a sudden, like the creature from the Black Lagoon, the water started bubbling. There was a huge noise, and the beast emerged. The girl untangled herself from me and swam away. I never saw her again. When I wasn't in New York, I was in New Jersey. By that I mean that during the summers my mother sent me off to summer camp. She had started doing better and had managed to save a bit of money. And one summer, she announced that I was going off to Surprise Lake Camp. The big surprise at Surprise Lake was that there was no lake. just this little pond. I stayed there for 3 weeks, which seemed like an eternity, mainly because there was no television. I thought it was a prison. To me, it was like yeshiva again, where everybody ate communally, where you had to line up just to get something else to drink. The last thing I wanted to do was hike, and the second to last thing was play sports. One day I left the campground and went into the nearest town, which was Monticello, I think, and I bought a Fantastic Four comic book. That was my support network for the rest of the summer. I kept rereading it and rereading it. Eventually, I learned to make do with the camp's arts and crafts program because they had a mimeograph machine, and I learned how to publish a newspaper. I also sang in the camp talent show, which would have been pleasant if it weren't for the fact that it was the site of one of the most horrific things that ever happened to me. Those summer camp talent shows are all the same. Someone tap dances, someone else juggles, a group of people form a choir. I had some kind of singing group, and we were on stage. And since it was in the middle of the summer, the bugs were everywhere, more so because there were spotlights on stage. Right at my moment in the show, the rest of the stage went black. I was in the spotlight by myself. I opened my mouth to take a deep breath, and I swallowed a giant moth that died violently, squirming all the way down my throat. I couldn't wait to get back to my bunk and read the Fantastic Four comic book again. Camp was the first place I became aware that the world also had homosexuals. They were public latrines where everybody would line up and then do their business. There were no walls between the boys, just this trough. Next to me was a guy who I think might have been my age. He kept looking over at me and my member and asking what bunk I was in and commenting on this and that and asking me if I wanted to come over to his bunk. I said, "Do you have any comic books?" This took him aback a bit. He didn't have comic books, he said, but he was there. "Well," I said, "I don't want to go if you don't like comic books, unless you know where I can get some TV." This totally threw him. "TV? Why?" "Because I want to watch Superman," I said. This was a classic example of miscommunication. He was trying to pick me up, and I was trying to watch TV and read the Fantastic Four. Even though I was playing music at home and at camp, in Queens and all around Long Island, it didn't occur to me that I might be able to make a career out of being in a rock band. I had always worked, making deliveries or in the butcher store, and I saved like a madman. I never spent a dime on anything. I took great pride in the wad of cash I had accumulated, so I was never afraid of finding a job or making money. I knew how to do that. But as the band began to take up more of my time, it seemed like I might be able to find some way to make a go of it professionally. To make sure I didn't do anything stupid, Mom agreed to let me pursue my band, or whatever else I wanted, as long as I had something to fall back on. She told me I would need to go to college and get some kind of degree, in case my other plans didn't work out. It never occurred to me to challenge this condition. My mother's approval was extremely important. She was the reason I never smoked or drank or got high. Not when I was a teenager, not to this day. Because of her horrible experiences in the concentration camps of Germany, I was always very clear on the fact that I didn't have the right to break her heart. She had suffered enough. As a result, I'd always tried really hard in whatever I did to never embarrass her or in any other way hurt her. She gave me life. The least I could do to repay her was to give her happiness. Flaming Youth, My College Years, 1970 to 1972. I could have gone to school downstate or stayed in the city, but all my life I had grown up surrounded by Jews and the Jewish experience. On television, I saw a much broader and more diverse world, with blacks and Christians who were from different places and spoke differently and wore different clothes. Up until that point, I hadn't been out of Israel and New York, except for my brief trips to summer camp, and everyone there was Jewish too. The few experiences I had had with other kinds of people, like the black friends I had in 6th grade, were all positive experiences, and I wanted to explore them some more after I graduated from high school. I packed up and went upstate to South Fallsburg, New York, where I attended Sullivan County Community College. When I got to Sullivan County, I made sure that both my roommates there were black. My mother was scared something would happen to me, not because they were black exactly, but because she had lived through the Holocaust, where she had almost been wiped off the face of the earth. Anyone from the outside was a threat to her. She tried to strong-arm me. She said that if I didn't move out, she would disown me. Eventually she came upstate, and we had a heart-to-heart conversation. "Mom," I said, "I know you love me. I know you're trying to protect me and do what's best for me. but I have to try to figure this out on my own. It wasn't easy for her, but she let me go my own way. Once I was there at college, I tried to confront my own racism, or what there might be of it, by seeing whether I could live with these two guys. Were they any different just because they were black? The three of us got along fine. We played records for each other, we hung out together, and we ate together. There was a difference culturally. Some of it was in the speech. I couldn't quite understand some of the patois, and some of their cool references were completely alien to me. One of the guy's friends, actually, made money, he said, by being a gigolo. This seemed bizarre to me. Women paying for men? South Fallsburg was a tiny community. The entire town had 10 streets in all, and the school was the center. Primarily, it was a hotel and culinary school where people came from all over the world to learn to cook and run restaurant kitchens. I went up there to get a liberal arts education and to get away from my Jewish roots. I ended up smack dab in the middle of the Jewish mountains, the Catskills. I wound up being a lifeguard at the Pines Hotel during the summer. I had learned to swim and gotten my swimming credentials at Surprise Lake. When I then took the test to become a lifeguard, the Pines Hotel hired me. That was the place where I had my first sexual escapades, in which I actually took the bull by the horns. There was a black maid who cleaned all the rooms, including the rooms of the staff who worked at the hotel. We had these little rooms, just big enough to fit a bed and a sink in. One day, I was leaving my room and she was saying, "Okay, are you ready? I need to clean up the room." As we brushed past each other, I got aroused and closed the door behind me. She didn't object. She was young enough, but older than I was. I have always had respect for a clean room, never more so than that day. Being a lifeguard was a job, and I assumed it was an easy job. In an Olympic-sized swimming pool, you're never going to have to save anybody, right? Wrong. One day I was sitting by the pool, watching over the place, and this classic Jewish couple came along. She about 300 pounds, he about 100 pounds, she torturing him verbally, he barely alive. To me, they might as well have been 100 years old, although they were probably in their 40s. She decided to take a dip. All the way in, walking toward the pool, she was talking her head off to him. Talking. He wasn't even looking at her. I'm sure he had heard it all before, a million times. She dove into the deep end of the pool and promptly sank to the bottom. I looked up at him thinking, please God, make him dive in and get his wife. But he didn't move a muscle. Nothing. I had to jump up, get in there, get her up, and stick my hip under her, which is a kind of life-saving method. She was fighting me every step of the way. Even when I got her to the side of the pool and tried to hoist her up, I thought, okay, he's going to come over and help me hoist this 300-pound whale up out of the pool. But he did nothing. When she finally got up, with the help of other people, she went and lay down next to him on the recliner. She didn't look at him. She didn't verbally abuse him about not helping her. They both just stayed there quietly staring ahead. I thought it was the most bizarre thing I had ever seen. He didn't lift a finger to save her, and she didn't berate him for not saving her. That's marriage for you. People had their young daughters with them, these horny Jewish girls who were coming up there to meet boys. During the weekends, I'd work at the hotel, and at night there would be Holiday Inn dances, where AT&T telephone operators would come up for the weekend. Once my friend Stephen Carnell came up to visit me on the weekend. We danced with girls and so on, and got a room and picked up 2 girls and brought them back to the room. One of the girls fell asleep, and the other one was ready to be active with me. But I got engrossed in the movie. As I was watching it on the floor, Steve took my girl and started to do his business, finishing up what she had begun with me. I felt a little robbed of the experience and a little mad at Steve. But the next morning when we woke up and she was long gone, Stephen complained of a tingling sensation. He cock-blocked me, but caught the clap. On campus, the guys lived at the Green Acres Hotel, which was a rundown property that had too many vacancies to stay afloat on its own. So it let its rooms be taken over by the state university system. The girls lived at another hotel down the way. I romanced one girl who was quite a beauty. I have forgotten her name, but not her face. One weekend I arranged for her to come over and meet me in my room. I had the habit of inviting more than one girl, thinking most girls wouldn't show up, and that if you asked more than one, the chances were good that one of them would show up. So, in addition to this beautiful girl, I invited a girl named Nancy. I took a shower at 2 o'clock. I got dressed. 3 o'clock, which was the appointed hour, was drawing near, and there I was in my dorm apartment. I had my hot plate, I had my cans of beans, I had my Twinkies, I had all the things that were necessary to impress a girl when she came over to your room. The knock came at the door. I opened it, and it was the first girl. We didn't waste any time. My mattress was on the floor, and I took her down for the count. At some point, there was another knock on the door. I'm not sure that I heard it. Even if I did, I wasn't about to answer it. My roommate opened up the door, and there was Nancy, the other girl. She was so shocked that she started running down the hallway crying. I jumped up, put on my pants, and ran after her, and I eventually cornered her in one of my other friends' rooms, where I apologized to her profusely. She came back. By that time, the other girl had gone, and Nancy's tears turned to passion. She stayed with me that night, in my room, and I took her virginity. She was, I think, the first girl whose virginity I ever took. They say this is a big moment for girls. For boys, it's slightly different. I don't remember anything more than just being excited by the moment and continually but softly trying to break through. I felt like a doctor with a scalpel, because that's how you had to be. Later that night, I got up to go to the bathroom, flipped on the light, and almost had a heart attack, because there was blood all over the sheets. I wasn't prepared for that. I thought she was going to die, but I gave her a hot bath, and we stayed awake most of the night. The next day was a Sunday, and we basically just cuddled and watched TV. This initial drama turned into a relationship, and we would meet in the afternoons. She started thinking of me as her boyfriend, and I didn't do anything to discourage her. But I have to say that even when I was seeing her, I dilly-dallied. I took a theology class with an Episcopalian clergyman. I was a theology major. And one day his college-aged daughter came to visit him and attended his class. I was eyeing her throughout the session, and afterward I immediately cornered her and asked her how long she was visiting. "Just for the week," she said. "Do you want to meet me tonight?" I said. That evening she picked me up in a truck. We drove out into the cornfields and had each other. But these were side projects. I still had an emotional urge to go back to my girlfriend, and so I did. When summer came along, I decided to stay upstate instead of going back to New York City, and I started working at Zakarin Brothers, which was a hotel supplies warehouse. I was a gopher for the manager. I was still with Nancy, and she and I moved into an apartment right next door to Zakarin Brothers. We lived in the same apartment building as her best friend Maria and her boyfriend, who was a chef. Between all the cakes he baked and brought home every day and the food that Nancy made for me, I ballooned up to 220 pounds. My average day went something like this: wake up, eat some cake for breakfast, go next door to work, make some money, come home for lunch, repeat until satisfied. During the weekends, I would play with my band, Bullfrog Beer. It was a great time. Around us, things were in turmoil. The country was being torn apart at the seams. But I have to say it didn't affect me too much. Vietnam wasn't a factor. I saw more of it on TV than I ever encountered in life. Every once in a while, the school would be closed, and people would be marching up and down the street. I never marched with them. I always wanted to go to school because I had taken out a bank loan. I thought they were preventing me from going. Besides, I didn't feel that most of the marchers had it in their hearts politically. Protest was more of a social event, and most of the hippies were just rich white kids who didn't want to work for a living. College was a great experience. My musical career was coming along. My experience with women was proceeding to my liking. But when I got my associate bachelor's degree and my time at Sullivan County ended, I moved back to New York City, back in with my mother, and then went to school at Richmond College in Staten Island, which was part of the New York City university system. I was finishing up my education, getting my degree, which was part of my deal with my mother, but in my heart, I was planning how to make it in a rock band. When I first started playing in bands, we were following in the footsteps of a class of bands slightly older than us that had already made names for themselves. Billy Joel's first band, the Hassles, were already local heroes, and I was aware of them. I was aware of the Pigeons, who would later become Vanilla Fudge. I was aware of Aesop's Fables and the Vagrants. In general, these bands were Guido mods, Italian versions of English bands. They had shag haircuts and thick New York accents, and emulated the prevailing fashion, which was dictated by bands like The Who and The Kinks and The Faces. Imagine a guy named Tony trying to be Rod Stewart, and you'll understand that scene pretty well. For the most part, having a band was simply a tool for getting access to other things, mainly girls. Still, I was lucky in that I was in bands with friends who were obsessive record collectors. Stephen, for example, bought records like crazy, and he listened to everything from the Ventures to obscure British invasion bands to Mitch Ryder and the Detroit Wheels. Around that time, in the middle of 1970, I met Paul Stanley. He wasn't Paul Stanley yet, but Stanley Eisen, and he was circulating around the New York rock scene at the same time I was, trying to make a name for himself as a guitarist and a songwriter. He had even played in a band with Stephen Carnell. We were on parallel tracks, and for a long time we operated independently of each other. I was playing in bands as a bassist. I had picked up the bass when playing for the Long Island Sounds in high school. Everyone else wanted to play guitar, so I thought it would be a good idea to play something different, set myself off from the rest. I was trying to get gigs and write songs, and he was trying to do the same thing. Our parallel tracks even intersected, although we didn't learn about it until much later. For example, at one point I came down from upstate because I needed to replace a guitarist for a band I had there, and I went to see Stephen Carnell in Washington Heights. There was another guy there named Stanley Eisen, and Steve told me that the two of them were putting together a band called Uncle Joe, with 2 guitar players and a drummer. At another point, after Wicked Lester was up and running, I placed an ad for a guitarist to play on some demo recordings. This same guy, Stanley Eisen, who would later become Paul Stanley, was one of the guitarists who answered that ad. I didn't make the connection, though. Finally, the two of us met. Brooke Ostrander, Tony Zarella, Stephen Carnell, and I were starting to rehearse, and Paul walked in. Paul came in from a traditional middle-class Jewish background. His family also lived in Queens, where his father worked for a furniture company. And while we obviously had quite a bit in common, there were also some key differences. Paul's parents were very well-read, liberal, and assimilated, while my mother was cautious and not as well-read. In some ways, Paul's family was more like the families of the cousins I stayed with when I came to the United States. I'd like to say that Paul and I hit it off instantly, that a flash of inspiration passed between us, containing the seeds of what would eventually become the Kiss empire. But the truth of the matter is that when we first met in upstate New York, Paul didn't like me at all. He thought I was abrasive. I think it had something to do with the fact that after we shook hands, I looked at him straight in the face and said, "Oh, so you write songs? Let's hear them." I certainly made no attempt to be confrontational, but he got that impression. He got this expression on his face like, "Who's this guy think he is?" Paul and I have known each other now for 30 years. He has been the brother I never had, so it's somewhat difficult to remember that first meeting. But I can see how my manner may have been a bit off-putting. My enthusiasm sometimes comes off as a kind of arrogance, and I can see why he might have perceived me that way. I didn't have a father or a father figure or a big brother, so the only one I was ever able to turn to for inspiration was myself, or when I wasn't able to generate it, to Superman or King Kong. In a lot of ways, I was delusional, and still am. I am one of those few guys who can look in a mirror and believe I am better looking than I actually am. This has always been the case. As a result of this delusional self-confidence, when I got dumped by girls, it meant nothing. I would think, she doesn't understand, and go on to the next girl. Being relentless has its rewards. Every time I would succeed, I would think, see, I'm right. What accounts for this? Perhaps it's because I was an only child. Perhaps it's a result of my mother always being there and always saying the things that parents are supposed to say. She had survived so much hardship in the concentration camps that when she had me, she spent every minute of her time telling me the things that children should hear. You can be anything you want to be. You're better than everybody else. Don't let people outside get to you. When my mother would answer the phone and I was in the bathroom, it was, "The king can't come to the phone, he's on the throne." I guess you could say she spoiled me. While this was great for me, it wasn't always great for the people who met me. They didn't know what to take with a grain of salt and a sense of humor. As I quickly learned after Paul joined Wicked Lester, he wasn't so different from me. Immediately, he started hanging out with the rest of us, trying to write songs and push us up the ladder of local bands. But there was some tension in the band, particularly between Paul and Steve. They didn't get along, and I couldn't understand why. One day at his house, Steve turned around to Paul and said, "Who the hell do you think you are? Do you think you have some kind of aura around you?" And Paul said, "Yeah, I do think that I have an aura around me." So call it whatever you want. Ego, aura. I think you have to have a screw loose to do this, to be in the rock star business. Look at nature. Animals duck or flinch when they hear a noise. It's instinct. But there's always one animal that holds its ground and raises itself up to its full height. You see this with little dogs that bark at larger animals. Either this dog is out of its mind, or it thinks it's a much bigger dog than it is. You think the dog is crazy, but you also admire it for being fearless. If you think about it, any normal person would be scared to death getting up on stage and being scrutinized by an audience. But that never fazed me. And Paul, too, was driven towards the same goal. He has always been the kind of person who, though he's very intelligent, has to feel passionately about something or he doesn't do it at all. He went to an arts magnet high school. He had to pass tests and show high achievement to be admitted. Then at college, after just a few months, he left. It wasn't his thing. He loved rock and roll. Either of us alone might have made it, or might have cracked under the strain of all the disappointment and rejection. The two of us together, though, were unstoppable. None of this is to say that success was quick in coming. It wasn't. Our early gigs were nightmares. No crowds, no money. I remember one show at the Richmond College Armory. It was a dance, but nobody came. It rained nonstop and leaked through the roof. Paul caught the crabs from a dirty mattress on the floor. Another time we played a Jewish B'nai B'rith in New Jersey. We rented a milk truck and had to drive for hours just to be incidental music in the background, while all these Jewish American princesses walked around showing off their new dresses. All I knew was that we were getting paid $150 and having a chance to pick up some of these girls during our breaks. That wasn't a great success, although I did manage to corner one girl who started making out with me behind the curtains. But then Mom and Dad came and she had to leave. It was only 5 minutes, but I got a taste of her. The early hardship produced at least one benefit. It made us focus on our songwriting, which we knew was the only thing that would advance us as a band. Wicked Lester was, by that point, an all-original band. That wasn't so common then. Most bands were still doing R&B hits and Beatles covers, with maybe the occasional original thrown in. When we played, audiences would get into the music and then ask us what song it was. Who did that? They would say. When we said we did, they couldn't believe it. Before he died, Jimi Hendrix built a studio named Electric Lady, named for his Electric Ladyland album. It was located in downtown New York, and it was one of the most advanced studios in the world, with state-of-the-art equipment and an A-list clientele. Out in Queens somewhere, Paul had met a guy who worked in the studio. His name was Ron, and he told Paul to call him up at the studio and let him know when our band was playing. Paul did, but the guy never returned his calls. Frustrated, Paul put in a more aggressive call, told the secretary that he had been calling Ron, and that if Ron didn't call him back, his band was going to have to dissolve, and the blood would be on Ron's hands. As it turned out, the Ron that was getting all these messages wasn't the Ron that Paul had met at all, but rather Ron Johnson, who ran the studio. When we got him on the phone, we figured it was an opportunity we couldn't miss. "We have this band," we said, "and we're really good, and you should come down and see." He did, and he said that we had the most potential of any band he had seen since Three Dog Night, which was a big deal at the time. At that point, I was working at the Puerto Rican Interagency Council by day and then going to work as a checkout guy at a deli on Fifth Avenue around Union Square. Ron Johnson decided that he wanted to do some demos for Wicked Lester, but he wasn't quite ready for us. Paul and I hung out in the studio and did some session work. We sang background vocals on an album by Lynn Christopher and other people who actually were making records. We did demo work and got some real hands-on experience. We learned how to work a microphone and a multi-track recorder and so on. After a few months, Ron Johnson made good on his promise and started recording Wicked Lester with the hopes of shopping a demo to record labels. He liked our songs. He liked our look. He believed in us. Despite our brief apprenticeship, we were completely oblivious to the process of making a record. We didn't know a thing. We spent 15-hour sessions at the studio with barely any sleep, and at the same time we had to keep going to work or to school. But somehow we got through it. It's a miracle that we did, because we made every mistake you could imagine. When you're recording a song, you punch in the vocal track only so that you can lay down the vocal track without affecting the rest of the song. The engineer who was on duty that night instead pressed a button that recorded over everything: the drums, the guitars, the bass. After we finished with the vocal, he came and told us that we had to re-record the whole song. It was also our introduction to the soap opera of the music world. One of the other engineers on the session was married, but he was seeing a very exciting blonde on the side. She was always in the studio. One day, the wife showed up, and she and the blonde proceeded to tear each other's hair out. The poor engineer was in the middle, being pummeled by both sides. Everything was dramatic, bigger than life. Another time we were downstairs getting ready to record, and a stunning woman walked by. I went to talk to her, because I was always the advance scout, and convinced her to come up to the studio. Once we got there, she got right down to business. Before we knew it, she was servicing the entire band at once. This is something we had never seen except on sexy videos. mistresses and wives and catfighting and groupies crowding into the studio. Paul and I never left the Electric Lady. During recording sessions, we would try to pinch our behinds tight so we could hold off the inevitable moment when we would have to run to the bathroom. We just wanted to look over the shoulder of the engineer and digest as much of the scene as we possibly could. We finished the record, which had songs like Molly, What Happened in the Darkness, and When the Bell Rings. Ron started shopping it around, and pretty soon we got an offer from Epic Records. They liked what they heard, and they asked us to play at CBS Studios. We went down there, set up the amplifiers and the drums in the studio, and played the songs for them as best we could. Afterward, the record execs put their heads together. Then one guy surfaced and told us, well, the band's okay, but we don't want the lead guitar player. That was Stephen, my childhood friend. I was given the task of telling Stephen that he couldn't be in the band. I think we had a sense that this was going to happen with Steve, but he couldn't believe it. He felt betrayed. He wanted to know how I could do that to him, how I could let him be treated that way. It was difficult to explain, but I managed. This was one of my early lessons in the cruel division of the personal and the professional in the music business. Stephen and I remained friends after that, but it wasn't quite the same. He reacted well to my being friendly, and my attempts were genuine. I told him that I had every intention of recording the songs that he and I had written, and I did. She and Goin' Blind both appeared on the second Kiss record. Steve has had good royalty payments from those compositions over the years. But the truth is that there's no healing of a wound that runs as deep as that. You're about to get to the finish line of a race, you think you're going to win, and somebody pulls the rug out from under you. The decision wasn't malicious. It really was survival. But it was one of those life-defining moments. He could have been in Kiss, but it just wasn't meant to be. He formed a band called Lover, and as Kiss was growing, I would go and see him at these little clubs. The two of us would go to dinner. Those were always interesting dinners because I liked him very much as a friend, but the undercurrent of wistfulness was very strong. But you get it on both ends. After Steve was let go, there was a protracted period of waiting, during which time we decided to get another guitarist, a guy named Ronnie, who was a talented session player. We got Metro Media Records to come down and see us at the studio. As we were getting ready to play, we started to set up around the stage, but Ronnie was still sitting in a chair. We were flabbergasted. "Get up," we said. He said, "I'm a musician. I'm not a performer like you guys. You guys jump up and down. That's circus stuff. I'm a musician." Needless to say, he didn't last long in the band. As the months dragged on, Paul and I realized that Wicked Lester was unraveling. At one point, we looked at each other and said, you know what? This is not it. Whether we get a contract or not, this isn't what we want. In Wicked Lester, there were all these three-part harmonies that sounded like the Doobie Brothers, and there wasn't nearly enough guitar. Paul and I had started writing other material, songs like Deuce and Strutter, and we decided to put together the band we had always dreamed about. It's not that our tastes had changed, really. Rather, we became braver about making the band reflect our tastes. I remember going to see the New York Dolls early on. We knew that they looked like stars, and that's what we wanted to be, stars. We were in awe of them. But when they started playing, we looked at each other and said, we'll kill them. Initially, our idea was to fire Tony and Brooke and remake Wicked Lester in our image. But when we announced this to the other guys, they weren't happy about it. Our drummer in particular said that he was not leaving the band and would honor the contract, so we had no choice but to quit ourselves. We had a contract with Wicked Lester, but we didn't have a contract with each other, so Paul and I just left. At just around the same time, we suffered another major blow to our fledgling recording career. We had a loft on Canal and Mott Streets that we used as a practice space and a crash pad. One day we came in to practice, and it was like we had stumbled into the wrong room. The place was empty, picked clean to the bone. We couldn't believe it. Our equipment had been stolen, down to the last little piece. We had only the guitars we were carrying. So Paul and I went down to the sidewalk and played like street performers. I wasn't optimistic about the band that might or might not rise from the ashes of Wicked Lester. Paul wanted to start another band with me, but I told him that I was going to go upstate, back to Sullivan County. I planned to look for a guitar player and start another band, and I promised to call Paul when I got back. He said, No, I'll come along. So we went hitchhiking up there. We had a mission. As I remember, we were looking for this hot guitarist who was the big guy on the local Sullivan County scene. Right at the beginning of the trip, we got picked up by these two black guys. We were dressed in fur and leather, the whole aspiring rock star deal. We thought they would kill us. But they were nice guys, as it turned out. We started talking, and they weren't going as far as we were. So we got out and flagged down the next car we saw, and it happened to be a VW bus with these two girls in it. They weren't attractive. They were unattractive. But they were nice, and they invited us back to their place. It was a farmhouse, and it was filthy. One of those hippie crash pads. Not only was it filthy with dogs everywhere, but it was stifling hot. It was like a furnace in there because the heat wasn't regulated, and it was the middle of winter. Paul and I went to sleep in one room, and the two girls were in the other room. In the middle of the night, one of the girls got up and went to feed the dogs, and I woke up and saw her naked silhouette. I was going to go up to her and see if I could transact a little business, and Paul elbowed me. He was always more cautious in these situations than I was. "Cut it out," he said. "You're going to get us kicked out into the cold." So I went back to sleep. But then in the morning, she came into the room and opened the front door. The blast of cold air was so invigorating. I went to stand by the door, and I took the occasion to tell her about what had happened the night before. I said, "You know, last night there was a moment when I woke up and saw you, and I was aroused. And I thought about making an advance because you were quite beautiful." I made a long speech, and at the end of the speech she said, "I'm sorry, hold on a second." She reached into her bag and pulled out a hearing aid and put it in her ear. I had to repeat this whole long speech a second time, just as flowery as the first. At the end of it, she looked at me, and I was afraid that she was going to tell me that she hadn't turned the hearing aid on, but instead she said, "Oh, you want to fuck?" I did. So we went out to the barn, and we lay down on some blankets, and we began to get acquainted. But her hearing aid was on, and every time my head came near hers, I heard feedback noise from the hearing aid. It scared the pants off me at first. Actually, they were already off, but it was incredibly disconcerting. Eventually, I got used to it. We never found the hot guitarist in Sullivan County. It didn't really matter. The trip was like a rite of passage, a way for Paul and me to bond and to reassert our devotion to creating the best band imaginable. What began to rise to the top, ironically, wasn't the musical aspect of the band, but the entire package, the showmanship, the costumes, the hair, and so on. We were not wearing makeup yet, but we were heading in that direction, thanks in part to this unshakable faith, on both our parts, that this was the right way to get noticed in the rock world. Glam rock hadn't hit yet, and rock music was still mostly the province of hippies, guys in jeans and girls with long hair. How you looked wasn't as important as the music you made and the way you felt about each other. We didn't buy into that. I still remember the first thing that struck me about the Beatles when I saw them on Ed Sullivan, and it wasn't their music. It was the way they looked, perfectly coordinated, cooler than cool. They looked like a band. Even in Wicked Lester, the entire band toyed around with the more theatrical models of rock and roll. Stephen drew some sketches of the different personalities that we imagined for ourselves. Brooke was going to wear an Undertaker's hat. Paul was going to dress up as a gambler with a cowboy hat and twin guns and so on. I was going to dress up like a caveman and drag my bass behind me. Stephen was going to be an angel with wings. After he sketched out the plan, he actually went ahead and built his costume. He made an angel rig with movable wings and back. Clearly, the plan needed to have some of the wrinkles ironed out. But we were on the same wavelength, which was that we needed to keep pushing the visual appeal of the band. We weren't content to just stand there and strum our guitars. That wasn't enough.